Cool. So yeah, cryptographic assets. I'm going to go through a short history here, explain where I've come from, and what my kind of mission is within this industry. I've been an IT professional and working with cryptography for the last 30 some odd years. Can everyone see my screen that I'm sharing now? Okay, sounds good. So I've given this conversation that generally my audience is at traditional financial asset conferences. But cryptographic assets and being able to share, hold your own trust in assets is become a hot topic over the last, especially the last 5 years. When we look at how we transfer either currencies or assets of value, being able to do so without a third party, without someone else being in control of the asset itself is something that a lot of people have become very interested in. Looking at different currencies now, hopefully a lot of people are aware a little bit more when you look at fiat currencies, and there are methods of exchange currently with fiat currencies that we really, as the end users, are no part of holding on and remaining part of the direction of that value. And what I mean by saying that is, central banks that are typically not run by governments, typically are private organizations. They are kind of an at-will policy of printing their capital. The traditional fiats now are not asset-backed. The last real asset-backed currency was the US dollar, and that's really why the US dollar went into kind of a global, became the global of the center trade, when the US dollar was backed properly to gold. But we moved out of that system, moved out of the gold asset-backed system for fiat in the US in the early 1970s, 72, 73. So since then, it's really just on the faith in governance. So really, we just put our faith in whatever these assets are, and they can kind of freely print and really devaluing. So most recently in April in the United States, we just had an additional 2 to 3 trillion US dollars printed. If you can imagine, that does muddy the water a little bit for people that have money in their own banks. But beyond freedoms of currency, there will be freedoms of other assets as well, freedoms of equities and many other types of properties. But I wanted to trace back, and what I've been giving this on is kind of the history of how we got here through network systems. So I'll go through the presentation. This is my first page here to open it up. It's someone who moved me a lot, Eric Hughes. He's the author of the Cypherpunk Manifesto. His statement is one of his last sayings in the Cypherpunk Manifesto is, "Let us proceed together apace onward." I've been a part of the cryptographic asset industry for just about a decade now. I founded a hedge fund in the industry called Ikigai Asset Management. The joke that I have is Icon has Byzantine. Byzantine fault tolerance is really what is at the center of decentralized blockchain, I guess, theory or communities, and that's really lies from the Byzantine generals problem, which is what Bitcoin solved first. There were many previous cryptographic assets to Bitcoin, but none of them solved the Byzantine generals problem, and none of them were Byzantine fault tolerant, meaning having Byzantine fault tolerance really provides a lot of security in the way that government agencies or corporate entities might want to attack a network. Being Byzantine fault tolerant, the higher level of Byzantine fault tolerance that you might have prevents more attacks and will allow you to run a network sovereignly away from governments. So going in back a little bit in time, 1976, there was a paper that was written. That was New Directions in Cryptography. This is Whitfield Diffie's Martin Hellman's paper. This really was the revolution in cryptography, and this is really, as we started having networked systems somewhat in the early 70s, and we started having processing power that was capable of creating these types of cryptographic systems. This was the paper that really kind of kicked it all There were a number of things that happened early, mid-70s to early 80s, that were very much of a part of the other parts of the technology that we use now. The RSA patent in 1977, describing cryptographic communication systems and method. That's used in many of the different security systems that we've used over the last 30 years, 40 years now. In 1980, Merkle came out with his famous Merkle tree, and this is all kind of a 4 or 5 year period of time leading up to David Chaum's blind signatures for untraceable payments. And that's really the first definition of what a cryptographic asset is. So that paper was written in Berkeley. David Chaum and a lot of other people in Berkeley were very integral in some of the first ideas of cryptographic assets and controlling unique digital properties, and his definition there really kind of got things kicked off. He moved on from there, and he really did create the first digital asset company. I'll go into that in a moment, but in his paper, Blind Signatures for Untraceable Payments, he really did kind of foresee some of the issues with anonymous payment systems that later would come and be kind of attack bases for governments. The last line here: problems like a lack of proof of payment, theft of payments, black market payments for bribes, tax evasion, and black markets. I mean, this was in 1982, before many people knew anything about this. But he, very much a visionary, someone who really was someone who really did propel this industry. 1989, he formed a group, and in the United States, kind of took a stance against a lot of cryptography, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But a lot of the best cryptographers in the world who had been operating in California felt it was time to move out. And so DigiCash was formed in Amsterdam, and this is one of their first photos in 1989. David Chaum is all the way to the left of the image, and all the way to the right, the gentleman sitting in front with the jeans, that's Nick Szabo. So we'll learn a little bit about him later. 1991 was the release of Pretty Good Privacy, PGP. And this is where a lot of people that started getting introduced to network systems. This is just kind of prior to where we had the vision of the World Wide Web and HTTP, and a lot of the systems that were mailing systems, a lot of the systems that were not only mailing lists, but kind of bulletin board systems. People were looking for unique ways to communicate privately. PGP was released that allowed you to have a key mechanism to be able to speak with people in a private manner. And that's when it came out. It kind of got popular. Then, all along the same time, Scott Stornetta and Stuart Haber released the paper of how to timestamp a digital document. And that's also a paper that's was very integral in Bitcoin white paper later on. But this is the time also where the manifesto for cypherpunk and understanding privacy started really becoming evident. So the cypherpunk mailing list, cypherpunks@toad.com, was released and started in 1992, and then the manifesto was released in 93. Stornetta later also did an improvement on his timestamping document in 93 as well. And then in 92, there was, a lot of people were looking at combating junk mail. And so a lot of the systems that were kind of the predecessors to some of the hashing methods that we use now for some of the digital currencies came out of a paper. Some of the thoughts came out of a paper that was done in 1992 by Cynthia Dwork and Mona Noir. So combating junk mail. The world's first electronic hash payment over computer network. So this is really the first payment that occurred over the World Wide Web. This is in 94. This predates using a credit card by about 2 or 3 months. So using DigiCash was really the first payment that was done over the internet. So this is a cryptographic asset. There were different websites that denominated, if you see up in the top right corner, we accept eCash. That was their brand, that was their stamp. If you went to, if you researched DigiCash, they had about 30 or 40 different companies that were accepting cash. You could go to them, you could buy their asset, and you could spend their asset on these websites. So that really was the first cash. The internet needed cash. This was from kind of a mid-90s on. That was one of the big sayings, that the internet needed cash. We need to figure a way to spend it. Transferring using credit card numbers over the internet really wasn't safe. There really wasn't SSL sockets layers yet for secure transfer and trade. So we were using networks like eCash first before credit cards. In America, again, we locked down on the export of cryptography. It was very well known by military uses. A lot of this did come from military uses. That communications, encrypted communications that we couldn't decrypt were dangerous to have in the hands of other governments. And so there was many documents that were created, many ways to block this. And during that time, a lot of people moved out to Canada. Montreal became a hotbed for cryptographic research. And the shirt that you see above was kind of a nod. You could walk with the code on a t-shirt or in physical paper form, but you couldn't transmit the code electronically, or else you were exporting a weapon. So this was a very high charge, a very treasonous charge for an American citizen. So a lot of those in the cryptographic field left the country. 1997, Hashcash, Adam back. So Adam actually worked for a good friend of mine, Austin Hill, up in Montreal, and they were working on a company, a security company. Some of the early ideas of Hashcash came about, and that again kind of came to combat kind of junk mail early on. But Adam had revisioned it in a way to create cash based on hashes. Again, they didn't have the idea of Byzantine fault tolerant networks figured out, but some of these early thoughts came from that, and those all stem from an organization called Zero Knowledge Systems, and that was Austin Hill's company up in Montreal. So a lot of movement that was still going forward. We still didn't have some of the big internet cash companies that came to be a little bit later on, 1998. A lot of people from different parts of the world knew that cash was needed, knew an easier transfer method was needed. So, you had PayPal and BillPoint really in the United States, and Flues and Beans were kind of those in Europe that had some access, some reach out to them. We all know that everyone kind of got rolled up by PayPal, and a lot of people started using PayPal. So a lot of people kind of moved away from what the needs were, though that was essentially controlled provider. And that's what a lot of people had to say against David Chaum's DigiCash, that it was essentially controlled provider. People were looking for ways that they could participate in it, not just be some center, some bank in the middle that controlled all of these assets and cash. So in 1999, there's a new type of experience started to emerge, and that was some of the online gaming experience. And that's when we first started recognizing that you could sell virtual goods. So Ultima Online and EverQuest were two of the big products that you could actually start kind of literally mining value out of the characters that you would create. And then selling those virtual assets on different networks. So eBay really became the first primary market for people to be able to sell accounts to where there were organizations and companies that started to set up to just have many people working at cheap labor costs to create and mine assets within the games, and then having those accounts sold via eBay. 2004. Hal Finney came out with a paper called Reusable Proofs of Work. And this was arguably the closest paper that we had seen to Bitcoin. As everyone here may or may not know, I'm assuming most people do on this call know, of the myth and legend of Satoshi Nakamoto. We don't know the creator of Bitcoin, which is, again, the most popular Byzantine fault-tolerant cryptographic asset. A lot of theories, a lot of people believe that Hal Finney may have been that person or may have been part of that team. And I implore anyone who hasn't read Reusable Proofs of Work to go back and read it. I mean, it is very, very close to the solution that was delivered in 2008. But what really happened between 2004 and 2008 was Nick Szabo came in, and who had worked again with David Chaum, and he added a few measures to this that really kind of turned it. If you kind of combine the Bit Gold paper and the RPAL paper, you really have something that looks like Bitcoin. So Bit Gold and its description and understanding about some Byzantine fault tolerance came in the Bit Gold paper with Nick Szabo. So that came out in 2005. In 2006, there was an organization called IGE out in China and in South Korea that was run by Brock Pierce and Steve Bannon, that was doing hundreds of millions of dollars a year in farming digital assets. So this really became the largest exchange. They actually built the largest asset exchange, the most varied different types of assets between 2006 and around 2010, 2011. And ultimately, I believe, were bought out by Goldman Sachs. So there was a lot of value in these virtual assets that were being explored, and there were a lot of people in those communities and those societies that were exposed to that first, because you had low-wage workers in China and South Korea realizing that they could spend time, automate things, create applications to automate the processing of digging for virtual gold or digging for virtual assets. And so a lot of the people out in those communities were exposed to the real world financial rewards of those type of systems prior to the buyers on the buy side, elsewhere. 2008 was the first, October 31st, on the Cypherpunk mailing list was the first Bitcoin white paper announcement. So this again happened in October 31st, 2008, kind of out of nowhere, and from someone that no one had really heard or talked to before, but the white paper was released. January 9th, 2009, Bitcoin was live. In the first Bitcoin block that was printed, the line "Chancellor is on the brink of the second bailout for the banks." That's what's written to the chain. This is an important time. The banks had been failing. The debt crisis was happening. The housing crisis was happening. Again, a lot of the central currencies were printing money kind of out of control. There was really no there was really no way as the end user of a fiat currency to hold on to your value. It was kind of being taken from you without your reasoning. So Hal Finney, he first started running Bitcoin on, or at least announcing that he was running Bitcoin on, January 10th, 2009. And I've also included his first transaction here. So the first transaction was 10 Bitcoin from the Nakamoto account to Hal Finney. So that was kind of the first, person externally who hadn't mined a block. This was the first send transaction. Satoshi created the Bitcoin Talk forums in November of 2009. This kind of became the center place for discussions about the protocol. Everyone was running projects from out of SourceForge at the time, so that's what the projects were. The old forum was at SourceForge, but this was their first kind of starting forum point as well, privately. And in between that 2009-2010 period, the external IT community started becoming aware of this in some ways. I at the time, I was working for a bank in a subsidiary of Société Générale in Chicago, and this is kind of right around the time that I first came in contact with it. And it was mentioned on Slashdot kind of famously twice, and this was the first one. And in this time, I think it went up from 30 cents to maybe $1.10 or maybe 90 cents or something like that after this, after it was the announcement, the 0.3 release was announced. But it was starting to get a little bit broader exposure. But a lot of people had seen still other cryptographic assets, and there really was no, there really was no guarantee that this was anything, but it was interesting, and it was, at least it got out to the broader engineering community. The first exchanges occurred, really the Bitcoin market was the first exchange, and that was in February of 2010. And then the kind of most well-known and most popular later exchange at the Magic the Gathering online exchange, Mt. Gox, was started by Jed McCaleb later in that year, or at least migrated to Bitcoin later that year. So he had created an asset exchange for Magic the Gathering cards, and then he moved it over to selling Bitcoin. The final message from Satoshi really was about what had been occurring with Julian Assange, and that was, when the capital controls were placed upon WikiLeaks, and the U.S. was trying to put a stranglehold around the power that WikiLeaks had to expose, information that was being leaked at the time. He migrated. They had frozen all of his bank accounts. They had frozen all his ability to receive cash donations, and he moved over to Bitcoin. And in famously doing so, and this is in December of 2010. Really kicked up the ire of governments, realizing that this was now then going to be a project that was really watched out for, looked out for. So this was kind of his last public appearance, and he was a little worried about exposure, rightfully so. Anyone, if you look back through the history of people who have tried to create alternative currencies in the face of centralized banking, there's been a lot of people who have been executed. A lot of people who've been murdered. If you look at from the Lincoln dollar to this silver certificates that JFK had been working on, there's a lot of people in many different political histories that face face death if they go against a central bank's control. So I'm sure that was part of the reason why he wanted to remain anonymous. And once this hornet's nest was kicked up, he really kind of disappeared from the public face. But from the 2010 to 2012 era, the code was open source for Bitcoin. So you had a bunch of people who said, "Hey, this is interesting. Now we've got the idea of Byzantine fault tolerance, and so we can kind of create these unique assets and then have them on networks to where you can have a distributed network that can provide some Byzantine fault tolerance." Other people started utilizing that for maybe minor adjustments and changing different things to maybe add other features. The domain name services and domain names are kind of the central attack point of the internet. So one of the only other ideas that Satoshi actually had mentioned was kind of utilizing this type of decentralized Byzantine fault tolerance system for coming up with changing for name services. And so Namecoin really was the first altcoin. And Peercoin and Litecoin appeared, very a short period after. But between 2010 and 2013, there were hundreds of coins that had come up, some with very minor adjustments. Again, what's the value in a lot of these things? The value in a lot of these things becomes the community that actually gets behind and actually starts to transfer, just as it is with fiat. Now, these can represent real-world assets. So, when you look at cryptographic assets and what they have the possibility of not only representing some value that we imagine, like the U.S. dollar, but they can also denote the land registries and equity registries and many different types of things, including maybe online digital asset ownership like Namecoin, like domain registries, etc. But this is when the altcoin kind of attack came. But there was really nothing new, nothing extremely new. Litecoin did come up with a lot of new parts that were kind of an experimental research side of the network, but Bitcoin kept chugging along. In 2012, J.R. Willett released a paper called the Second Bitcoin Whitepaper, and this kind of talked about a new asset layer on top of Bitcoin. And this was people started talking about colored coins. People started talking about not only having the Bitcoin asset, but potentially denoting different types of assets on top of that. And that's when things really started to move forward, and people started to look at the other things that you could place on top of cryptographic asset networks, which Vitalik was very interested in. Vitalik Buterin, who later became the founder of Ethereum, I know he started working with Mastercoin, which is what JR's network became. JR Witten ultimately launched the first tokenized sale. And this first tokenized sale, which kind of later became known as the ICO, which will later become known as many more things. That was the first start for it. And he actually Vitalik was working with Mastercoin and some of the people on the Mastercoin team out in Israel. And this was kind of where everyone's eyes were headed. But I think that there were differences in where they wanted to take the projects. And so Vitalik ultimately ended up, coming up with his own idea of what a tokenized layer would look like off of Bitcoin. So you had Mastercoin that was launching on top of Bitcoin, and then Ethereum, which was going to launch its own new network, specifically going for tokenized assets on top of a proof of work network. So this really was, we're kind of some of the first eras of tokenized sales. J.R. Willett's was done first, and Vitalik's was done shortly thereafter. On top of the Mastercoin network, one of the most interesting assets that was done, and this is really the first sale here. This press release, this was arguably, it wouldn't have been called that at the time, or wasn't called that at the time, but 4,700 Bitcoin were used to sell the tokenized assets of the Mastercoin network. And the BitAngels network, which was founded by David Johnston and Michael Turpin, they were the first kind of group to get around the sales of these type of tokenized assets. So if anyone wants to point fingers of blame at what the ICO market became, look no further than BitAngels. But they did a very interesting thing. So a lot of people then recognized that you could create these tokenized sales that were kind of beyond the ire of the SEC in the US, and create and sell tokenized assets. Around the same time, Jed McCaleb, who people will remember from the Mt. Gox days, Jed created, and it was part of creating another network called Ripple XRP. He got in a little argument and issue, and he helped create many other networks. But there's a really funny story about him kind of getting out of his ownership of XRP as he was ejected from the company, and then ended up starting Stellar. But if anyone wants a really good laugh, read the FCK XRP stories, because Jed is a very, very smart individual, and he maximalized his exit from that partnership, I think, very, very well. 2014. What's
I think your time's about done, a bit over.
Oh, am my time? No,
Yeah.
I thought I had
wrap
an hour.
up. If you want a quick 2-minute wrap up, go for it.
Sounds good. I'll run through the last couple of slides real quick.
No
We had Realcoin, which launched on Mastercoin, that ultimately became Tether, which was interesting. Ethereum launched its own Ether coin in 2014, and that was its first crowd sale. Augur and the DAO kind of began the ICO Madness. First decentralized exchange was in 2015, BitShares. The ICO Madness really in 2017 is kind of what everyone recognized and really kind of pushed towards secure assets. Blockchain Capital launched the first really tokenized security. 2017, CryptoKitties brought upon the first real NFT, although there were NFTs launched on the Counterparty Network in 2016. A lot of scams were out in 2017 as well. Everyone should be familiar with BitConnect and the type of scams that do operate in these early markets. The secondary trading of digital asset markets started taking place in 2018. Open Finance did the first legitimate securities market. I'll cut there. A lot of interesting, fun things are still happening, but yeah, it's definitely an interesting part, and I believe that the DAOs of the future. So if anyone's looking for something interesting in the industry, continue to look no further than what's going on in the world of DAOs.
DAOs. Thank you very much, Tim.
You're welcome.